Good day. Welcome to the Discover UofSC 2022 Keynote panel. With us today are four distinguished researchers representing the best of the university. These research ambassadors are here today to share some of their stories, their insights, and to give you advice on how you can be more productive in your career. Let's take a look at the panel. To my immediate left is Professor Gloria Boute. She's the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Carolina Distinguished Professor in the Department of Instructor and Teacher Education. Gloria, what is your area of research?
Thank you. Good day to everyone. I'm an educator, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. So my research focuses on equity methodologies. I'm learning how to implement equity in K-12 schools. I have two lines of research. One looks like something called culturally relevant pedagogy, where I look at how teachers teach particularly students of color in effective ways. And the other one is called African diaspora literacies. That is learning how to be literate about people in the African diaspora. How do we teach about their histories, their epistemologies, their cosmologies, everything? How do we do that in an effective way in schools?
It's great to have you with us. And next to you is Professor Tim Mousseau. He's a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and in the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. So what is your area of research, Tim?
Thanks, Augie. Yeah, it's great to be here. My formal training is in evolutionary genetics, and I started off my career looking at how organisms adapt to changing environments. More recently, though, the past 2 decades, I've been looking at how radiation affects organisms living in the wild, and in particular working in Chernobyl and Fukushima and other hot parts of the planet.
Wonderful. It's great to have you with us. Next to you is Professor Melissa Nolan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Melissa, tell us a little about the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, thank you, Augie. It's really, truly an honor and a privilege to be here today with such formidable experts as well. So I'm interested in infectious disease epidemiology, which most people naturally think of COVID, but before COVID, I was doing a lot more vector-borne disease, which means things from mosquitoes, ticks, kissing bugs, oh my. So anything that you can get. There's about 1 billion people infected every year from these different insects, and so I'm interested in finding ways that we can lower that transmission. Thank you.
Excellent. And our final member of the panel is Professor Mark Smith. He's Carolina Distinguished Professor in the Department of History. Mark, what kind of work do you do?
Thank you for having me here. It's a real honor and a pleasure. I am an historian of the American South, and despite the fact that I'm not from round here, probably gives me some odd perspective about what it means to be Southern, and by default what it means to be American. And I head up the Institute for Southern Studies. My principal area of interest is the history of the Old South and the Civil War, but I also work on the history of the senses, which is to say not the thing that happens every 10 years, but smell and taste and touch and sight, as a way to understand the texture of the past beyond sight. So it's a form of sensory history, and my interest in Southern history and sensory history have merged, and I've written on a book on the sensory history of the Civil War, for example. So I'm all over the place, but happy to be in the South.
Wonderful. Well, you can see we've got a very diverse panel, but very accomplished panel. And let's drill down a little bit. Let's start out with things that excite you. What excites you or drives you, or what has led you to conduct your research? And Mark, we'll start with you.
What excites me is, well, frankly, the excitement of doing research. I mean, it is exciting, discovering something new. And for an historian, that can take one of two forms, really. Oftentimes, you discover a new document, perhaps a new newspaper, a new diary, especially if you're working in the 19th century. But fundamentally, for me, the excitement comes from a different kind of research. It's a research. You're searching again materials that you think that you know, that you think are well known, that everybody thinks they already understand. But if you have a different radar when you approach that same stage source, it can be extraordinarily exciting. It can spark your imagination. So when I look, for example, for evidence about the senses in the past, what do people think about smell in the past, I will take the most banal, well-understood documents we possibly have and research it. I'll read it again with an eye to a nose or with an eye to an ear. That, to me, is the fundamentally interesting thing about historical research, because in that way, nothing is ever old.
Now, you've said that when you find something that nobody has noticed before, you find it. Can you give us an example of something like that?
I sure can. So my book on the Civil War, I chose the most predictable events that everybody thought they knew. So I chose the firing on Fort Sumter, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. Dozens of books have been written on these topics, but I chose these things precisely because people thought they knew them. And my job was to say, hang on a minute, I'm going to re-narrate this for you. I'm going to rework this for you, so that Gettysburg now becomes a story about smell and the stench of battle and the stench of war. Everybody had seen it just as a visual spectacle. There was a whole olfactory history to Gettysburg that had not been told. That's the excitement of taking something that people think that they know and reworking it.
That's fascinating. Melissa, how about you? What really excites you?
Well, I'm very passionate about infectious disease epi. I would say there's a couple of things that really excite me. The first one is being able to really get out into the field and interact with patients. That's something that, at this point in my career, I don't get to do as often. I tend to be more writing the grants, writing the manuscripts. So getting out in the field is particularly exciting to me. Beyond that, I'm really passionate about mentorship and seeing my students be successful in research and seeing that gleam in their eye. My brother and I were the first in our family to go to college, let alone we both got our PhDs. And so mentorship to me has been a key part. And every time that I see a student be more successful than I was at that phase, that's really what motivates me and excites me to get up in the morning and to keep going.
But now you're talking about you want to get out there in the field with infectious diseases.
Yeah.
Oh, and we're in a pandemic. How do you balance those?
Well, I'm very fortunate that I can be very persuasive, and I've been able to still continue to travel. So my work is most often, I'm interested in emerging infectious diseases from insects. So you have to go to resource-limited countries. That's typically where they originate from, unfortunately. And so getting to the root. So we've been able to establish in the last 2 years, expand our site in El Salvador. We've been able to establish a new site in Colombia. And this summer, I'm going down to the Brazilian Amazon to get to look at how deforestation is impacting and creating an emergence of malaria and other new infectious diseases. So yeah, it's very exciting to be an infectious disease.
Excellent. Tim, how about you? What gets you going?
It's always been about discovery and exploration and the ability to be completely creative, even off the wall if one wants to be, to pursue new ideas. And for me, having a sort of an outdoor, field-oriented basis, it gives me an excuse to go to exotic new places and see a different part of the world. And this experience of exploring new areas opens my mind. It gives me new ideas. And I found that this is easily transmissible to my students as well, who, again, always come back with profound returns on that kind of experience. Really sets them going. So it's really very simple. I tell my students this is the very best job in the world, because if you're at all good at it, it gives you almost total freedom to pursue any new ideas you might be turned on by. And I've certainly enjoyed my time doing this.
And what's the most exotic place you've ever been?
Gosh, it's just one after the next.
Got to pick one.
Got to pick one. In recent history, the one that really kind of, emotionally motivated me was a visit to the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific, sort of halfway between Hawaii and Australia. 1,000 miles from anywhere. And I was there because the U.S. had tested 67 atomic bombs there in the 40s and 50s, and so there was some remnants of the radioactivity related to that. And when I got there and we were exploring some of these uninhabited atolls, again, in the middle of nowhere, walking the beach. And within every field of view, there was some garbage that had washed up from some other distant part of the planet. Usually plastic, a sole of a shoe, some container. And that one has been, that experience to me really hit me hard in terms of the impact that humans have had on the planet and the need to follow through with research on how to address this concern.
Wow. Gloria, how about you? What drives you?
I'm excited about how humans and humanity exist around the world. I see my work as a scholar activist, and that means that I can do my scholarship and also to provoke change as well. And so I'm particularly interested in equity methodologies and trying to figure out how can we create lives that are more equitable. And that means going all over the world as well to just see how people culturally live and what makes sense to them and how we can build on that.
And where has your research taken you? What's the most exciting place?
I agree with Tim. Everywhere that I've gone has been exciting. But I am an Africanist, so I particularly like going to different countries in Africa. Probably, I would say, my favorite place is Ghana, but the most exciting place has been Nigeria because there's a rich history. And I also would say ancient Egypt, which in my field we call Kemet. So it's really interesting to see the origin of much of civilization and sort of look at the continuity across time and what that means for us now.
What's so exciting is we think sometimes of research being taking you into a lab and having the focus. And what I'm hearing here is research is also a chance to travel a field not only across space, but across time. And picking up that excitement. Let's talk a little how we got involved in research. Who wants to share their experience of how you first got interested?
I will offer the underappreciated but really quite important factor of luck and happenstance. I was an undergraduate at the University of Southampton in England, far removed from the history of the American South. Southampton is known principally as the place where the Mayflower and later the Titanic sailed from. Hardly distinguished in that sense. But I happened upon a professor who was on exchange from the University of South Carolina, who's now retired, and I ended up taking a course with him on American history. In fact, I was writing my undergraduate dissertation on West Indian immigration to Britain after the Second World War. It had nothing to do with the American South. So I took this course, pure luck that he was there, that I got in. I think it was a course I didn't need. It was an elective of some sort. And he assigned me a book, a very complicated book. I later learned that it was one of the most influential books about Southern history. And he said, I would like you to present on this, read it and dissect it. And I did. And he said, well, that was interesting, but utterly wrong. You misinterpreted the book fundamentally. And that really got my goat. And that really piqued my interest. So I was determined to get this book right. And once I'd gotten it right, or at least better, he said, right, now we can have a chat. And I would pepper this poor man with questions about the American South, to the point where he said, I can't answer your questions any longer. You need to come to the University of South Carolina to pursue your PhD. And that's how I ended up here. Long story short, that is the chance. But chance is really about capitalizing on these nice moments where you could leave that, you could not take that class, you could not ask those questions, you could not read that book. But if you capitalize on those happenstance moments, you can really change the trajectory of your life. And that certainly was the case with me. And I ended up going back to England to teach at the University of Birmingham, then coming back here later in my career to teach. And I often think I would like to be the person that inspires that kind of happenstance reaction among my students.
Gloria, how about you? How did you get your start?
In graduate school at Iowa State University, I majored in child development, and of course it was very heavily research-based. And I remember my first course on research and do my first attempt to do a study and write it up, and the professor said, perhaps this is your first time doing this, and it actually was. But having to read lots of articles, and then learning again that I could study things that were of interest to me. And having been an African-American child at some point, and understanding some of the things in my schooling that I would have liked to see better, I started to study something called African-American language, which is some people call a dialect, a variation of English, how people learn that. I started studying different methodologies for assessing African-American students, looking for more culturally sensitive ways. And so for my thesis, I studied psychometric and Piagetian measures of intelligence among Black and white students. I was interested in trying to find more sensitive ways of studying and measuring what African-American children knew cognitively. But so I really started in graduate school. Although I kind of agree with Zora Neale Hurston. She says that research is simply formalized curiosity. So I've always been curious, and even in undergraduate school, of course we did research papers, but I think in terms of formalizing it, that was in graduate school.
Now, one of the things that most people point to when they say, not how did you get started, but how did you advance, is mentorship. Mm-hmm. Do any of you have a story of a mentor who really made a big difference in your life?
Well, I think everyone here has had many mentors and, more importantly, advocates throughout their career. It's really a critical element of our personal development. And for me, the most important advocate, mentor was my undergraduate ecology professor who took many of us on field courses. Back in those days, to get a degree in biology, you actually had to do field experiences where you would travel for a week or two with the class to a new, novel environment, usually to a field station. And for me, it was to a biological field station on the Bay of Fundy in Canada, which has the highest tidal range in the world, 50-foot tides. The water goes up and down every day, as opposed to Charleston where it goes up 5 or 6 feet. But, as a consequence, the organisms living there had to, adjust to this really stressful environment. And this mentor took us there, provided us the opportunity to develop questions and hypotheses, and to put that together with testable predictions that we could actually go out to the field and measure, and then pursue the rest of this scientific method, communication mostly. Without that kind of guidance early on, without that experience early on, I certainly wouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, any mentor stories?
Sure. I've had some really incredible mentors absolutely along the way. One person I think that really stands out, and a good story about him, is Dr. Peter Hotez, who you might know somewhat from the COVID. He's gotten a little bit more popular, but he's in charge of a big vaccine institute in the National School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. And I remember early on, he was always really supportive and encouraged us to submit grants constantly and papers. And I had a big grant that I'd put in that didn't get funded, and we were talking, and I was really bummed about it, and quite honestly embarrassed, because I thought, gosh, this is this guy that's brought in millions and millions of dollars, and I can't live up to that level. And I will never forget, he said to me, Melissa, you're supposed to fail. Mm-hmm. He said, we're not in the science of doing cushy, flashy science that's easy. We're here to change the paradigm. We're here to save lives. We're here to push the field forward. And to do that, you have to have really high reward, high exploratory, risky ideas. And he said, so if you're not failing, you're not doing it right. And ever since that moment, he really instilled in my mind that, every grant that I put in, whether it gets funded or not, I'm proud of myself for that. And to really try and come up with these really innovative conceptual ideas that, can make a change. And he really inspired me. And he just got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So obviously he's doing something right. Oh. So a good person to follow in his footsteps.
Now, for all of you, when you're thinking about having a mentor, we know they're important. Is it something that just happens, or did you seek a mentor, her or him out?
I think it's a really interesting question, because I think that mentors sometimes come to you, but I think the really interesting ones, you have to ferret out. And that means putting yourself in a space where that person can come to you. So in my instance, and I've had many wonderful people at the university, but also outside of the university. Let me thread this back. The book that I mentioned that I reviewed as an undergraduate was a very famous book by a historian called Eugene Genovese. He's passed away now. It's called Roll, Jordan, Roll. My first professional presentation was as a graduate student in Gambrel Hall. And my paper was dedicated to telling everybody in the audience why Eugene Genovese was wrong. Right? Afterwards, I went outside to have a cup of coffee. A gentleman came up to me. He said, "That was an interesting paper." And my name is Eugene Genovese. And I said, "Oh dear, I'm sorry." And he said, "Look, half of that I think was wrong, but the other half was interesting. Can you send me the paper?" And I did. Several weeks later, I get 8 typed pages, single space back. And that really helped me think about what would later become a book. I was a very young graduate student, but it seeded me. And my point here is, if I hadn't given the paper, if I hadn't been willing to put myself into a space where people could hear me, I would never have found him as a mentor. So certainly some mentors will come to you, but you also have to be proactive and sort of seek them out.
As well, I would say also for me, I think I stopped mentors for a long time. And I think sometimes we're mentored from actually just reading the work of some scholars. So for years, 3 of the people who ended up mentoring me later, I stalked them wherever they went, when they were presenting, whatever they published, I read it. And finally, I reached out to them. And so that was the way that I ended up developing a relationship with them.
Lessons from research that you apply in other areas.
You know, as a scientist, and having started life as an experimentalist from a very early age, you know, I apply the scientific method to almost everything I do, and it really it's a way of seeing, as they say. For me, it helps me to discriminate fact from fiction. It helps me to wade through the complexity of modern life, and you know, applying the scientific method in various forms is a cornerstone to what I think of as human evolution in recent history. You know, it's really interesting to think that, you know, humans as a species, humans as we know them now culturally, have only been here for a few thousand years. You know, the agricultural revolution began maybe 10,000 years ago. We've been on the planet for considerably longer than that, but it's all of the action in our species has occurred following that event, following the ability to culturally transmit information from one generation to the next, and following the advent of the scientific method, which is really what has provided the tools to develop new knowledge. And so that really has been, you know, a lifelong process for me, and I think I wish we had a little more of it in society today.
Absolutely. I would say there are no clear delineations, as you said, in our lives and in the research, because we learn to be critical, whether we are watching television, a movie, trying to decide on a product to buy. We do use the scientific method. And so it's really sort of a way of living, a lens that we use.
One of the things that we all have to do is overcome obstacles. We all have challenges along the way. Can you think about challenges from your experience and give some advice to people watching that might help them overcome challenges that they're going to encounter?
I think one thing that's already been said is in terms of trying to seek funding, you're going to get turned down. As a mentor told me, actually the process of grant writing is rejection. You're going to get rejected. Just learn how to revamp that, you know, resubmit, and keep it moving. I think that's one piece of advice I would offer.
You know, I would say that these challenges are actually opportunities in disguise. You know, if it's hard, sometimes it sort of is worth trying, and you know, it's really about taking these opportunities as they arise, and you know, hopefully you have the skills in place. You know, you have to be at that nexus of your personal skill development, and the opportunities, and to be able to take it to that next step. And so it's really, you know, challenges are a good thing. And yeah, they are an opportunity to learn and move forward.
Well, people say the bigger the challenge is, the more you have to overcome, the more satisfying it is when you reach the goal. But along the way, we all have to face the rejections. I want to drill down on that issue. Some advice, more specific advice for our students on how they can overcome rejection.
I would also say be proactive to begin with. Like, for example, with publishing, I have a routine I do. Before I submit a paper, I typically present it at a conference, get feedback, and then sort of tweak it.
Nice.
And it's worked for me very well. I have had rejections, but not many. Also, just know your audience as well. Know who you're communicating to and what your message is, what you're trying to say. And of course, be very familiar with the journal venue you're trying to present to as part of knowing the audience. Yeah, but when rejection comes, again, dust it off and just resubmit and keep it moving. I think when you work, if research becomes part of your life purpose, which it is for me, then you will find a way to get over the rejection and find another angle to make it work.
You know, I'd follow up on that very sage advice there from Gloria. I would simply add that some of the best researchers that I know have a heavy dose of humility with them, and that is to say they recognize that their creations are inevitably going to be failures at the beginning, and that is not a barrier. That is in fact a good thing. But you have to have a certain humility when you receive feedback, when people tell you that this isn't quite right. And certainly in the historical profession, we tend not to get large grants and what have you. Our humility comes from the sentence that you've labored over and isn't quite right, or the paragraph that doesn't quite fit, and you need to be open to the criticisms from people who are your peers and superiors. And then sort of take away from that the fact that, you know, you're not going to get it right the first time, and frankly, the stress on perfectionism can be quite debilitating. It's not going to be perfect. What it's going to be is good and it's engaging. But in a way, I think I tell my students, don't strive for perfection. That will probably hobble you in the long run. Strive for something that you are proud of, but you also recognize will be criticized, hopefully in a robust and reasonable way. This is the nature, the dialectic of our profession, regardless of which field you're in. I think that we have to be open to that conversation for us to progress both as fields and as individuals.
Well, we also have to be careful not to personalize it, that a rejection is not a rejection of us.
That's right.
And if we ever get a rejection, say, oh, they don't like me. No, this is a piece of work that is not what they were looking for, and the work can be changed and improved.
I don't totally agree with that. You know, there's a lot of personality involved in the pursuit of research, and there's a lot of interpersonal interactions that can color, bias, you know, and additionally challenge us, and you just have to be prepared for that, and you know, develop a little bit of a thick skin, but it's. We are humans, after all, and so there's always going to be that human element to everything we do.
Well, let me go off script and follow that up a little. The politics of research. Any advice on handling the politics of research?
politics are a part of research. That's very true. And in my field, and I'm sure in y'all's fields as well, I feel like there's kind of two perspectives of how people approach it. There's the generation or the approach of we're going to just beat you down so that you can then build yourself back up. Or there's kind of the more supportive approach, which I like to do. I would say politics is in everything you do in life. It's not just research, it's in your job. And, I've even had this conversation recently with my doctoral students. Acknowledge the fact that people are going to judge you on first impressions. You can't change that. That's a fact of life. But what you can do is, from the inside out, create change. And I would love to know how Gloria feels about this. But I had the good fortune of meeting Nelda Stark. She was the first female physician at the Texas Medical Center. So she was completely male-dominated field. I'm in a very male-dominated field, so I've had some unique perspectives and challenges for me. And she told me, she said, Melissa, you can't make change from the outside. What you have to do is get in, gain their trust, and then you slowly create that change. So for her, what she did was she would read the newspaper, the Sports Time every day. So when she would see her colleagues, be like, hey, Joe, how about, that game last night? What a pitch or whatever it was, I don't know. And for me, I'm still kind of figuring out how to do that, but I think I've done pretty well here. I mean, I've gotten to work with a lot of, the executive leadership, and maybe some of that is just realizing that at the end of the day, we're all people. And so, for example, one time I was at a conference and ended up being on probably the slowest elevator ride of my life with Sophia Gold, who is a pharmacy billionaire. I mean, she's got more money than God. And I remember thinking, it was just her and me, and I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to talk about with her? And I remembered, oh, she's from Spain. So I said, hey, how was the flight over? That's 8 hours? Yeah, it was not bad. And I said, oh, are you watching any good Netflix shows lately? And, that simple act, then she ended up inviting me to a private meeting with her scientific advisors, and now I get to go up to Harvard every year to meet with them and give my perspective on the disease I study. And so, long story short, remember that we're all humans, and having humility, having respect for other people, that's how you're going to overcome the politics.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And another point I wanted to make about politics, too, within any discipline, there are different paradigms. And politically, when you're thinking about submitting your work, you need to know what the reviewers, where they're coming from. I mean, there have been times where I've gotten rejected, and all of the reviewers' comments where I'm like, they don't understand the work I'm doing. So part of the politics is really understanding, the different assumptions of the different paradigms, and know where to submit and who you're talking to again. But I totally, agree that you can change from the inside out. I really like your strategy.
One of the challenges we have, obviously, we know that we'll get more attention when we're doing something new. How do you come up with a new idea? And Mark, you've talked about that a little on re-examining what's already there. You want to take this one first?
So I tell this to my students quite clearly. I think to understand novelty and originality requires you to have a deep understanding of what preceded you. That means that you can't read things just from the past 10 years. You have to go back decades. And of course, the point is here that the longer the historical profession exists, the harder historical writing is, because you just have an accretion of more and more books. But I tell them, and I edit a series for Cambridge University Press on the American South, and we will often get manuscripts submitted that make rather audacious claims about originality. And sometimes they're simply wrong, because I know there was a book published 35 years ago that dealt with precisely this topic. So you have to be very careful, and it does take investment of time and a certain tenacity to read those other works in order to ascertain whether or not this is genuinely new. And then, of course, there's the ethics of this question. Don't claim novelty when in fact it's not, especially if you don't know it is, if you know it's not new, because you will get caught in the review process. Very rarely do people get away with this. And I do think that it's genuine original intervention is quite rare, and I think it needs to be recognized as rare. It is not this kind of eureka moment. What it is a function of hard work, happenstance and chance to be sure, but a deep familiarity with your professional protocols, your historiographies, the genealogy of knowledge in your profession. If you know that, then you know what's new. And that's your point of intervention.
I'd like to add on top of that, I absolutely agree. In any field, the historical context is fundamental. You have to know it. But you also have to have the skills to take it that next step, and you have to be willing to grab the opportunities when they arise. So it's the nexus of those, three dimensions for me that you need to sort of clue into.
I would expand that a little bit. I think everything you said is absolutely true. I also think research is a lifestyle. You have to be naturally inquisitive in your everyday. Mm-hmm. So for me, I like to read the New York Times every Sunday morning and just read about other things that are going on. So for example, when we first walked in, I know that Tim does work in Russia, and so trying to keep up with politics, it goes back to all of it. And so reading about other disciplines beyond what you do makes your work better. It gives you ideas.
Absolutely.
So not just focusing, within your immediate discipline, but just being a more well-rounded researcher and as a whole and more rounded individual will, I think, create your ideas on its own.
Could I piggyback on that fundamental point? I think that's exactly right. In a way, I think you have to fight quietly against the very forces of higher education at a certain level, which corral us into highly specialized disciplines. Of course, there are immense dividends to that. You become an expert in your field. But what it tends to do is it can be quite limiting unless you apply that curiosity that you rightly point out. Think outside of your field. Read outside of your field. Often that will spark something inside your particular area of specialization that otherwise would remain dormant. And I wrote my first book on the history of time consciousness in the American South. And everybody said, well, there was no time consciousness. Well, there was. But the reason I came to it is because I was reading on the philosophy of time. Outside of my field, had nothing to do with the Old South, but I managed to import and kind of smuggle some of these understandings into my field. And I think you're entirely right, Melissa. The more you read outside of your field, the better your field ends up becoming.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, let's take that a step further and talk about living life. How do you have a fulfilled life? How do you balance the demands of research and the focus your field wants with the demands of life?
You go to the Marshall Islands. You travel a great deal. I mean, look, I travel a lot too, but I don't go to the Marshall Islands or the Amazon. I think a robust life, a textured life, can be international certainly, but it can also be intensely local. You have to have your radar honed at all levels during pretty much a daily existence. So I work on the history of the senses, and I wrote a piece last year on the impact of the pandemic on our sensory interactions. That's simply a function of my observation. There's no historical documentation of this. So I wrote a think piece, and I was interviewed on Australian broadcasting radio last week about it. That was really me looking around. How had the pandemic and the public policies underwriting the pandemic reframed our sensory interactions? And they're quite profound. The absence of the handshake. Touch became domesticated. You touch people inside your house, but not externally any longer. Food, the taste of the pandemic lingers strongly, doesn't it? The number of soggy hamburgers we've all had because you can't go to restaurants, or you couldn't early on. That really is a function of being immersed in your moment as an historian. There was an historical dynamic to this, to be sure, but I think I was looking around and applying my historical knowledge to my present context. And that, to me, was very typical of the way that I go about research anyway.
Your talk about the census also makes me think music, food, exercise. Do any of these or anything else play a role in your life that help balance your research work?
You're talking?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I love to travel. And again, a lot of times it makes the research seamless. I've gone to every continent except for Antarctica. But I tell my students that the academy does not love you. understand that if you die today, and I've seen it happen, what's going to happen is people will say, well, we've got 2 new positions. That means understand how to balance your life. Work hard and play hard. I'm losing at the playing hard right now, but I'm trying to regain that. But family and friends. I love theater. I love movies. I love dancing. And I try to do as much as that as possible. This makes for a whole person, you know. Again, we're curious about all of life, but also make sure you have a balance.
I completely agree with that. Like you said, you have to have this balance. In some ways, you know, we are all special, but our struggle to find the work-life balance is not special. Like, we're all struggling with that. And from my perspective, I'm a young mom, and I remember my son came earlier than anticipated. And I'd been writing this grant for 3 months, and I was like, I'm getting this grant in. I'm literally in labor writing this grant. And I'm like, stay in there a little bit longer.
That's dedication.
And I will never forget, my mentor came to see me in the hospital, and she said, Melissa, I'm going to tell you the truth. I can't tell you what grant I wrote 10 years ago, but I can tell you what my daughter was doing 10 years ago. And she said, if you don't make time to be a mom, you're going to burn out, and you're going to look back and you're going to regret it. And I think the one advice I would have to myself as a younger person is to find that work-life balance. And so for me, I've learned to, you know, we have our time, me and my son at night, our family time, and that's dinner. So I don't check my emails. I don't do that. That means I do have to get up at 4:30 in the morning to make up for it, because you can't. There's no secret to success. It's hard work. That's it, really. But you should definitely make that time, whatever that is for you. If it's going out with friends, if it's exercising, you know, whatever that might be, it's so important that you find that for your mental health, for your research, just for enjoyment. Life is meant to be good.
I simply have to co-narrate on this as a mom as well, because when I was in labor with my second son, I was finishing my second book, and I remember typing like, whoa! But I was determined to finish that book and get submitted, and I did. But with my children, when they were young, I did something similar to what you did. From the time they were up until they went to bed, I was with them if we were not at work. And then from 8 o'clock, I put them to bed, relaxed until 10, and then I would work from 10 to 2 because I'm a night owl. And I mean, for years, I lived on 3 to 4 hours of sleep as well, which I can't do now, but I could do then. But they were not neglected because, as you said, you have to remember your real purpose. I always say my 2 greatest works are my children. Those are my 2 greatest works.
I love that.
I'd like to add a little bit to that, and that you know, I think from the perspective of the audience here today, the main point, I think, is that it is quite possible to have that work personal balance, work-life balance, no matter what you do. But you know, what I try to share with my students is, you know, not every minute of the day is suitable for every activity. And you need to be smart about how you use your time. And so, you know, for a lot of people, it's working late at night, you know, staying focused during that period that you know you're going to be productive in that activity. For a lot of people, it's first thing in the morning. For me, it comes and goes. What I try to do is capitalize on those minutes of lucidity that, you know, that pop up every now and then, and to run with it as long as I can, and then go play afterwards. And you know, you just have to be smart about how you use your time.
Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to look ahead. You are in such disparate fields. I want you to take a second and tell me what you think, how you think your field is going to be different in 20 years. Who wants to go? Melissa, go ahead.
We are in a technological revolution right now that's driving us towards big data. So I'm a primary data person. You know, I've worked with hundreds of people, not, you know, data sets with millions, but that's where we're going in every field. And so, you know, for the students in the audience today, I would really encourage you to consider, you know, if that's a passion of yours, get in that field, because it is a growing field, it's a demanding field, and I anticipate it's just going to become more important in our lives and work.
I would say something maybe a little bit different because in my field, one of the things I've noticed, like, is the difference in the nature of research, even over the last few decades to now. Like, our students are doing more qualitative research studies where they can get up close and personal. They're involving participants in ways that the participants are central to the work they do. I've had doctoral students now do work like ethnopoetry, autoethnography, things that sort of nature, more critical research, asking systemic questions. So the research methodologies have changed a lot, and I anticipate they will continue to do that. And one change I think we're going to see, at least in the social sciences, I think the dissertation as it exists is going to change. It has already. Many of our students elect to do other products, like maybe publish 3 articles instead, maybe come up with a soundtrack to express what they're doing, and making the work accessible to wider populations of people, not just talking to ourselves as academics.
20 years down the road, thoughts, Mark?
I mean, we're living through it now. We're living through a revolution, sort of a radical democratization of information. We used to be the exclusive gatekeepers of knowledge. The people come to us, we know it. And historians are especially on the front line here because, you have an historical question, you Google it, and you'll find the answer, or at least some answers. And of course, people fear this, don't they? Because any kind of democratization of information that challenges their particular provenance and their information vault can be worrying. But I say embrace it. I say embrace it. And for the reasons that Gloria astutely pointed out, I think that we need to take our cue from the very sort of democratization of information. We need to make our material more accessible, put it out there in different forms, and this is going to change our profession in profound ways. I do not think we will still have scholarly monographs in 20 years' time for history. I think what we'll have are really involved series of podcasts, perhaps, presenting this information in a way that it's accessible, digestible. I think that they're going to be subject to the same standards in a way, but I think we're going to have to let go of some of the old touchstones that people have used for tenure and what have you, simply because if we don't do that as historians, I fear that people they will get their information from the internet regardless, and our gatekeeping mechanism will just evaporate, and probably rightly so. So I do think that this is a great opportunity, but I think it takes a certain courage, and again, back to humility. There's a lot of information out there. You need to be a voice in it, but also recognize that you're not the only voice.
That's right.
Tim, 20 years.
Yeah, so in my area, the action is building. It's growing at this interface of informatics and biotechnology, genomics technology primarily, and the digital revolution, as it were, has replaced the printing press and has again provided an exponential growth in the information that's available in an instant, in a flash, without ever leaving your computer. And all of this is coming together and leading to these next steps in human evolution. And assuming we survive what we've been doing to the planet in one form or another, it's going to be a magical time. It's going to be absolutely incredible. 20 years from now, I'm just so looking forward to the progress we're going to make in terms of solving problems related to disease, world hunger, all of these global objectives.
Yeah.
And with the people watching being the ones who are going to be working to solve it.
That's
All right,
right.
let's help them along the way. Just 2 questions left. First, what are the most important skills or traits that those who are watching us right now need to have if they want to be effective researchers?
Look, the skill sets are highly particular and contingent on your field. I would say the single most important trait, at least from my perspective, is tenacity. Tenacity, keeping at it, not giving up. You will fail, You will hit all sorts of difficulties along the way. But if you stick at it, you will succeed. So it's an old-fashioned thing to say, I realize that. But tenacity, to me, is arguably certainly one of the most important qualities that will get you through.
Melissa?
I completely agree with that. And I think, knowing your science is very important. Beyond that, some of the things that have helped me be successful that I kind of stumbled into was really basic stuff. So you need to know how to manage a budget. You need to know how to build a team. You need to know the HR aspects when your two teammates aren't getting along, how to do that. Communicating effectively. So I've really gotten with the pandemic into more communicating just with lay audiences. So don't be afraid. Yes, you're going to publish a book, but then get out there, get on WIS TV and talk about what you're doing. Go speak to, libraries and to your community audience. Let them know what you're doing, because a lot of times I feel the reason, I think we all agree we're underfunded, right? We need more money, but at the end of the day, we're not going to get funded if people don't know what we do. So that's a big aspect of it.
Okay, Tim?
Tenacity, perseverance, communications. I would argue that the skill of being able to communicate effectively, both in writing and orally, is the single most important skill that every student has to develop. We've invested. That's where the investment has to be.
Okay, Gloria?
And I agree with everything that's been said. I would add understanding the purpose of your work and doing authentic work, not just doing contrived work, having a reason for doing that. And I think this was said before, understanding where your work comes into the conversation, understanding the antecedents that came before and sort of where you are in that conversation and what you are contributing.
Okay, we're down to closing words. One quick thought from each of you. It can be a piece of advice, it can be a piece of counsel, it can just be a sage limerick. What would you close with?
I would say congratulations. You've chosen a fabulous university to pursue your interests, and this is the place that will enable you and give you the context that enables your success. So, well done. You're off to a good start.
I would say be bold, be curious, and have fun.
I would just add, just do it. Get involved. Do research. It'll help you in every aspect of your life.
Plus one to everything that was said. Do work that matter. Have fun in life. And congratulations on being here at the University of South Carolina, a great place to be.
Thank you all very much. And I want to also acknowledge all of you who are watching. By the mere fact you've taken an hour out of your time to share with us, you've shown part of your commitment. And I hope you continue to pursue your passions using some of the advice given by our panelists today. Let me thank them individually. Dr. Gloria Boute, Dr. Tim Mousseau, Dr. Melissa Nolan, and Dr. Mark Smith. We'll give them virtual applause. And thank you all for participating in Discover UofSC 2022. I hope you continue to enjoy the activities of the day, especially the presentations of cutting-edge research we have from all our colleagues. On behalf of the College of Mass Communications and Information Studies, I'm Augie Grant. Thanks so much.